In this video, I'd be primarily focusing on two important units. One is narrative modes of thinking, and second, textuality and reading, which are included in Module 3 of your textbook titled Methodology of Humanities and Academic Writing, the textbook which is prescribed for second semester English graduate students of Kannur University. Well, the first point which we'll be discussing is about the narrative modes of thinking. As we all know, our mind can think in different possible ways. Or in other words, the human mind has developed various modes of thinking. And these modes of thinking could be broadly classified into two. One is logical and the second one is imaginative. Now, what do you mean by logical? Logical means it follows a logic, and that is the cause-effect relationship. So, we will discuss in detail subsequently what is this cause-effect relationship. Second point is imaginative. So, this is basically a kind of an introduction to the discussion which we are going to have soon. Now, regarding the narrative modes of thinking, the American cultural psychologist Jerome Bruner has coined two modes of thinking, that is called logico-scientific mode and narrative mode. Now, let us first take up the first one, that is logico-scientific mode. From that, we can understand that it is made up of two terms. One is logic and the other one is scientific. So, in this logico-scientific mode of thinking, we would be basically thinking based on the kind of relationship that is cause and effect. He says, logico-scientific method is a scientific way of analyzing an incident or event, and it demands two elements for the completion of meaning. One is the cause and the other is effect. Perhaps you mustn't have understood exactly what it is being discussed. Let us try to explain with the help of an example. All of you know the story about the tortoise and the hare. So the tortoise and the hare, they made a race, and in the race, tortoise rather moved very slowly but steadily. But hare, on the other hand, it ran fast, and since it was rather overconfident, it took rest and finally fell asleep. And tortoise slowly and steadily won the race. Now, if we describe this narrative based on logico-scientific mode, it could be mentioned in this way. That is, the tortoise won the race because the hare slept out of overconfidence. So, there is a cause and an effect relationship. The effect is the tortoise won the race. The cause is the hare slept out of overconfidence. This is logico-scientific method, where it is a scientific way of analyzing an incident or event based on cause-effect relationship. I hope you have understood this, and let us move on to the next term, that is narrative mode. Narrative mode simply means that one event is being followed by yet another event, and it is nothing but a chain of events. So, according to him, in the narrative mode, one action happens and the other follows. It is a sequential description of events. The pattern is framed within a chain of events. So, narrative mode is nothing but a sequential chain of events which follows one event after another. It invites the reader to fill in the gaps left by the narrator, inspiring the reader to fill the gaps left by the narrator, inspiring the reader to imagine the rest of the occurrences. Let us take up an example. That is, the king died and the queen died of sorrow. Him, in the narrative mode, one action happens and the other follows. It is a sequential description of events. The pattern is framed within a chain of events. So, narrative mode is nothing but a sequential chain of events which follows one event after another. It invites the reader to fill in the gaps left by the narrator, inspiring the reader to fill the gaps left by the narrator, inspiring the reader to imagine the rest of the occurrences. Let us take up an example. That is, the king died and the queen died of sorrow. So it is here it talks about two events, and the two events are sequenced together or chained together. That is, the king died and the queen died of sorrow. That's all. So these are the two important ideas which are brought forth by Jerome Bruner. One is logico-scientific mode and the other one is narrative mode. And now let's come to the next unit, that is textuality and reading. I'm sure that you are new to the term called the textuality. Let me try to explain this term first. Before that, let us talk about what do we mean by text. A text could be a novel, it could be a story, it could be a film, it could be a piece of music, or even a play. So anything could be considered as a text, and textuality refers to how a text functions and is being interpreted. So a text doesn't have one particular interpretation, but rather it opens up multiple interpretations. So textuality refers to how a text functions and is being interpreted. Now let us come to three important points which are being talked about by Seymour Chapman, that is teller, tale, addressee, or reader. So for every narrative, we can understand that there needs to be a teller or an author, and the author is the one who creates the tale or the text. And if the text has to gain life, it has to be read by a reader. As I said before, the text gets its life through the hands of the reader, but the role of a text or tale in the narrative scenario and the importance of interpretation by the reader is a dilemma to be answered. Let us Let me try to explain that. So, the role of a text. What is the role of a text? What is the function of the text? What is the purpose of the text? And the importance of interpretation. Because a text doesn't have one particular interpretation, but rather it can have multiple interpretations, or it can have plurality of interpretations. So this role of a text or the function of a text, as well as the type of interpretations, are a kind of a dilemma to be answered. That is the meaning of what is being written over there. And according to Seymour Chapman, the process of narratives could be analyzed through the diagram of narrative communications. And he has introduced this concept in his book titled Story and Discourse, Narrative Structures in Fiction and Film in 1978. In his 1978 book, he talks about the narrative text. In the communication of a narrative text, there are different elements such as a real author, implied author, narrator, narratee, implied reader, and real reader. So I'm sure that you know about the terms real author and real reader. Real author is the author who is the creator of the text, and the real reader is the reader who reads the text. Now you are new to two terms. One is the implied author and the implied reader, which I shall discuss in detail subsequently. But however, from this communication of narrative text, we can understand that these two elements, that is real author and real reader, are left outside the box. That means that Chapman is primarily interested in the transaction between the implied author and the implied reader, and he is not much interested about the real author and the real reader. In a narrative, there are three basic elements, and they are the author, narrator, and the reader. Now, as I said before, according to Chapman, real author and real reader are left out, since the implied author as well as the implied reader are the major functioning elements in the narrative transmission. Furthermore, Chapman claims that the narrator-narratee pair is also optional. His primary concern is on the transaction between the implied author and implied reader in the process of creation of meaning in a text. Therefore, the three core roles in literary narrative transmissions are the author, narrator, and the reader. So by now, you would be very much confused or perhaps curious to understand about the implied author. But before entering into the description of implied author, let me talk about the typology of author. The term author, that means who is the creator of a text, was coined from a Latin term called auctor, which includes generally the creatorship of factual and fictional texts. And this term auctor was in prevalence from 15th century to 18th century, which includes all scholars and poets, and they were generally considered as authors. And there was little distinction was made between the creators, copyrights, editors, commentators, and compilers of text. All were generally considered to be authors. Now we shall come to the idea, what do we mean by an implied author? The terms implied author and implied reader are the contributions of Wayne C. Booth, who introduced these terms in the text titled The Rhetoric of Fiction, published in 1951. Now, what do we mean by an implied author? The implied author is neither the real author nor the narrator. It is not the true voice of the author either. But implied author is the image constructed by the reader during the process of reading. So the implied author is not the real author, nor the narrator, or even it is not the true voice of the author, but it is an image constructed by the reader during the process of reading. The writer in the text only uses a precise tone, pace, degree of detail while narrating a work of art. The author uses a precise tone, the pace, a degree of detail, etc. And it is the implied author, who is otherwise known as inferred author, who infers the sensibility and intelligence, or it is the implied author who helps to draw out an intended meaning plus effect of the narrative to the reader. In other words, implied author is the image constructed or inferred by the reader during the process of reading to create an intended meaning plus effect of the narrative. It serves as a guiding influence on the narrative. Implied author shapes the tone, style, and ethical perspective of the story, influencing how the reader interprets the narrative. It reflects a consistent set of values, beliefs, and narrative styles within the work. I am sure by now you mustn't have a concrete understanding of what an implied author is. Let me try to explain this concept with the help of an example. All of you know the English novelist, poet, essayist, and journalist George Orwell, who is popularly known for his two important novels. One is 1984, published in the year 1949, and the second one, Animal Farm, published in the year 1945. Animal Farm, as you know, is a dystopian novel where the animals turned out to be the rulers, and finally what finally ends up is a kind of a totalitarian regime or system. Actually, this novel uses an allegory, and it is a satire to comment on political system, particularly the totalitarian systems of government or regimes. The implied author in Animal Farm is inferred through the narrative's satirical tone, straightforward language, and clear moral perspective on the abuse of power. So the implied author is not the narrator or George Orwell, the real author, but implied author is inferred through the narrative's satirical tone or the language and the clear moral perspective of the abuse of power, which are being inferred by the reader. The implied author presents a consistent set of values and beliefs about the dangers of totalitarianism, corruption, and the manipulation of power. So let us go back to what we have discussed earlier. So once again, I say the implied author is neither the real author nor the narrator. It is not the voice of the true author, but rather it is an image constructed by the reader during the process of reading based on the values, beliefs, tones, styles which are inferred by the reader through the process of reading. I think by now you are clear about what is being meant by implied author. Now we shall move on to yet another important topic, that is 8 types of narrations which are being proposed by Wayne Clayson Booth in his text titled The Rhetoric of Fiction, published in the year 1961. In this book called The Rhetoric of Fiction, Wayne C. Booth talks about 8 types of narrations. Let us discuss each one of them. Before entering into these narrations, let us first familiarize ourselves with what do we mean by a narrator. A narrator is the voice or character who tells a story or conveys the events in a work of literature, film, or other forms of media. The narrator serves as the intermediary or the mediator or go-between the events of the story and the audience, providing perspectives, content, and commentary of the narrative. There are 3 types of narrators. One is first-person narrator, second is second-person narrator, and finally third-person narrator. So first-person narrator tells the story using the pronouns I or we, providing a personal account of the events. By the use of pronouns I and we, the first-person narrator tries to crop up a kind of an intimacy with the reader. The second-person narrator uses you as the pronoun to directly address the reader or a character within the story. And finally, the third-person narrator describes the events from external perspective. He is never part of the narrator within the narrative, but rather he is external, and he uses the pronouns such as he, she, or they, and the narrator may have limited knowledge of characters' thoughts and feelings. Let us talk about the first idea which is being proposed by Wayne C. Booth. So, in his text or the book, The Rhetoric of Fiction, he provides a framework for understanding various types of narration and narrators within the narrative. And the first one is heterodiegetic narrator. So, this heterodiegetic narrator is one who is not a character within the story and exists outside of the narrative. Actually, he is not a character within the narrative, but rather the narrator exists outside the narrative. This type of narrator is not directly involved in the events of the story, but observes and reports on the events from an external perspective. Let me try to make it more clear. Heterodiegetic narrator is a narrator in a tale or a story where he is never part as a character within the story, but rather exists outside the story and observes and reports the events from an external perspective. They often use third person, they are often third person narrators who use pronouns such as I have mentioned earlier, he, she, and they to describe characters and events. Let me give you an example. All of you know the English author Jane Austen, who has written many novels such as Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, Emma, Mansfield Park, etc. In Pride and Prejudice, the narrator tells the story from a third person perspective, remaining external to the events and characters. So the narrator is never part of the story as a character within the story, but rather the narrator exists out of the story and observes and recounts the events as they unfold, offering insights into the character's thoughts and feelings without being a participant in the story. Okay? Now moving on to the second type of narration, or the second type of narrator, that is heterodiegetic interdiegetic narration. So from it we can understand that we have already discussed heterodiegetic, and it is a combination of two types of narration. One is heterodiegetic narration and intradiegetic narration. So we have already seen that heterodiegetic narration is a kind of a narration where the narrator exists out of the story and then observes and recounts or gives information about the events and characters. An intradiegetic narrator, on the other hand, is a narrator within narrator is a character. On the other hand, intradiegetic narrator is a character within the main narrator, making them an intradiegetic narrator. So now let us come to the second type of narration or narrator, that is heterodiegetic intradiegetic narration. We have already discussed in detail about heterodiegetic narration. That means a narrator who is never part of the narration as a character within the tale, but rather exists outside and observes and then gives information about characters and events. Now, the second type of narration is a combination of two things. One is heterodiegetic and the other one is intradiegetic. Uh, as I have said earlier, let us read the first one. That is, in this form of narration, the story includes different narrative levels. The main narrative is narrated by an external heterodiegetic narrator who is not part of the story. However, this narrator introduces a secondary story, also known as a story within a story or a frame story. So, this heterodiegetic narrator introduces a story within a story or a frame story, and this frame story or a story within the story is being narrated by the intradiegetic narrator. So, the intradiegetic narrator is the embedded story is narrated by a character within the main narrative, making them an intradiegetic narrator. This narrator is involved in the events of the secondary story but still remains under the control of heterodiegetic narrator in the primary narrative. In other words, the second type of narration, that is heterodiegetic, intradiegetic narration, is a combination of two types of narration, where the heterodiegetic narrator gives the external narration and that narrator introduces a story within a story or a frame story. And this story within a story or a frame story is being narrated by the intradiegetic narrator, who is a character within the main narrative. Okay, heterodiegetic narrator is never part of the narrator within the narrative, but on the other hand, intradiegetic narrator is a narrator who plays the role of a character within the main narrative. Let me give you an example. In Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, where the main narrative is presented by Mr. Lockwood. The heterodiegetic narrator is Mr. Lockwood, who tells the story, and he hears it from Nellie Dean, and that is the story within story, the intradiegetic narrator and a character within the main story. I think from this example, you have understood the second type of narration. Now, let us move on to the third type of narration, that is, or the third type of narrator, that is homodiegetic narrator. A homodiegetic narrator is a narrator who is also a character in the story being told. This type of narrator is directly involved in the events of the narrative and often tells the story from the personal perspective. So, homodiegetic narrator is a narrator who is directly involved in the events of the narrative, and the narrator or he tells the story from his or her own personal perspective. The narrator's role can be either the main character or a secondary character, but they are always part of the narrative world who gives a personal account of the story's events and characters. This type of narration is typically presented from a first-person point of view, usually pronouns such as I and me. Let me cite you an example. In F. Scott Fitzgerald's famous He is a famous American novelist, and the famous novel is Great Gatsby. Nick Carraway, who is a character within the novel The Great Gatsby, narrates the story in the first person, providing his personal perspective on the main character, J. Gatsby, and the events that unfold. His narrative is subjective, shaped by his impressions and observations. So, a homodiegetic narrator is a narrator who is directly involved in the events and offers a personal perspective of the events that unfold. Now, coming to the fourth type of narrator, that is autodiegetic narrator. Most of the autobiographies are written in the form of autodiegetic narration. For example, is Kamala Das' My Story. Well, let's see. An autodiegetic narrator tells their own story. In this case, the narrator is the protagonist or main character of the story. Most autobiographies involve autodiegetic narration. The narrator recounts events and experiences from their personal point of view, providing the reader with direct insight into their thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. An autodiegetic narrator tells the story in the first person using pronouns such as I and me. The famous example is Kamala Das' My Story. Now coming to the fifth kind of narrator, that is first person omniscient narrator. The first person omniscient narrator is a character in the story but knows the thoughts and feelings of all the characters present. So now we have already talked about a heterodiegetic narrator who gives details about the events and about the characters, but a heterodiegetic narrator doesn't know what goes through within the mind or the feelings of the characters present. So, the first person omniscient narrator is a character in the story but knows the thoughts and feelings of all the characters present. Such narrators have insights into other characters' thoughts, feelings, and motivations, as well as information about events they did not directly witness. The narrator tells the story from a first person point of view using pronouns such as I and me. The famous example is by Alice Sebold, The Lovely Bones, where a young girl who is killed observes the family members struggling in grief to cope with the disappearance of the girl. So she is able to understand the thoughts, feelings, etc. of the other family members who are struggling in the grief to cope with the disappearance of the girl. So that is the first person omniscient narrator. Now coming to the sixth form of narrative, that is alternating personal view narrator. From the title itself, we can understand that it is alternating. So there is a kind of alternating. So now coming to the sixth type of narrator or narration, that is alternating personal view. Alternating, from the title we can understand that there is a switching between different characters. So, in this form of narration or the narration, uh, the narrative moves back and forth between the omniscient third person narrator to a more personal first person narrator. The story is told from multiple first person perspectives, switching between different characters throughout the narrative. So, there is a kind of a movement back and forth between omniscient third person narrator to a more personal first person narrator. For some time, the tale moves through the omniscient third person narrator, and then suddenly it shifts to a personal first person narrator. And the best example to cite is the Harry Potter series that is being written by J.K. Rowling, which is told in third person. And as the narrative moves in third person, suddenly it deviates from omniscient third person narration to other characters, where the characters would give a first person perspectives. So that is the alternating personal view narration, where there will be a kind of a switching or the kind of a movement back and forth between the omniscient third person narrator to a more personal first person narrator. Now, coming to the seventh one, that is stream of consciousness narration. So, you must have heard about stream of consciousness technique, that simply means that stream that is continuous, the continuous kind of narration without any kind of logical kind of unity. So, stream of consciousness is a narrative technique that attempts to represent the inner workings of the character's mind in a realistic and often unstructured manner. Actually, the stream of consciousness technique has come from the medical field, where a patient is allowed to talk without any hindrance by the doctor, and obviously the patient would be talking continuously, and there may not be any kind of logical sequencing, so it would be unstructured. So that is used in fiction as well. So William Faulkner, Virginia Woolf, etc. They have used this technique in their text. And the stream of, once again, we can see that stream of consciousness is a narrative technique that attempts to represent the inner workings of the character's mind in a realistic and often unstructured way. This approach seeks to depict the continuous flow of thoughts, feelings, perceptions, and sensory impressions of a character, often in a non-linear and fragmented style. It is non-linear, it is fragmented, but rather the narration continues or flows continuously. The thoughts come in the form of a stream, feelings, perceptions, etc., without any disturbance. However, this flow of thoughts, feelings, perceptions will not be in a linear or structured fashion. It will be non-linear and it will be unstructured. A stream of consciousness voice gives a narrator the rare experience of expressing interior monologues, inner desire of motivations, and pieces of incomplete thoughts. For example, William Faulkner's text novel The Sound and the Fury, and Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse. Now we have come to the final point, that is epistolary voice narration. So all of you know what do we mean by epistolary voice. The word epistolary comes from the Latin adjective epistularis, that is derived from epistula, which means letter or written communication or epistle. So, the epistolary voice is a narrative technique that tells a story through a series of documents, most commonly letters, but also sometimes through diary entries, emails, texts, or other forms of written communication. In this style, the story is revealed through personal writings of one or more characters. Such a narrative does not have a single narrator, but the author communicates the narrative with the information collected through letters. The best example is Alice Walker's The Color Purple, in which the epistolary voice can be used, or the epistolary voice is being used to create a deeply moving and impactful narrative. So these are the 8 types of narrations, or the 8 types of narrators which are being brought forth by Wayne C. Booth, the American literary critic and scholar